Welcome to the Resilient Retail Game Plan, a podcast for anyone wanting to start, grow or scale a profitable creative product business with me, Catherine Eardley. The Resilient Retail Game Plan is a podcast dedicated to one thing, breaking down the concepts and tools that I've gathered from 20 years in the retail industry and showing you how you can use them in your business. This is the real nuts and bolts of running a successful product business, broken down in an easy, accessible way. This is not a podcast about learning how to make your business look good. It's the tools and techniques that will make you and your business feel good. Confidently plan, launch and manage your products, and feel in control of your sales numbers and cash flow to help you build a resilient retail business. Welcome to episode 35 of the Resilient Retail Game Plan. My name's Catherine Eardley and I'm your host, as well as the founder of the Resilient Retail Club, which is my membership group for creative product businesses. And you can find out more at resilientretailclub.com. Today is another very special episode. Last week, I kicked off with the first of 3 episodes going through the very detailed survey that I ran of over 300 product businesses, digging into the reality of running a product business in 2021. So today we are going to touch on marketing. I asked product businesses several questions about their social media marketing, their email marketing, paid advertising, as well as how long they were spending on marketing and the channels that they were using. And that's what we're going to run through today. As I mentioned last week, if you want to get more detail, and there is a lot more detail, I promise you there is so much more to dig into here, then go to resilientretailclub.com/survey and you can download your free copy of the report. It's around 50 pages long. It's got fascinating statistics from everything from how much people pay themselves to how many orders they're taking every week. And there's some really great figures for you to benchmark yourself against if you've ever wondered what's going on inside other people's businesses. So let's kick off then today's episode. Marketing, whether or not you love it or hate it, it's one of the most important elements for product business owners to grapple with. But often people worry they're not doing enough, or they're doing the wrong kind of thing, or they're putting their effort in the wrong place. So I wanted to ask a series of questions just to really help understand what a typical, if there is such a thing, product business is actually doing. The first question that I looked at was just simply asking which social media platforms people were on. Now, it will come as no surprise to most of you to find out that 97% of product businesses have an Instagram account. That means that more businesses have an Instagram account than have a website. About 88% of businesses had a website, 97% had an Instagram account. 86% had Facebook as well. Facebook and Instagram accounts are often the same thing, but it was just really fascinating to see that as nearly as many people had websites as Facebook accounts, for example. The next channel after that was Pinterest. 39.5% of people had Pinterest accounts. 20% were on Twitter. I was surprised to see Twitter pop up as the 4th most common account. Then it was LinkedIn, 11% on TikTok, 6% on YouTube, and just one respondent, or 0.3%, who was on Snapchat. I wanted to change the focus then and ask which was the most successful, because of course, many people are on multiple channels, but which one was the one that actually drove the most sales? And again, no surprises, Instagram at 62.5% was the most successful channel for nearly 2/3 of businesses. And then Facebook was the most successful channel for another third, which means that between them, Facebook and Instagram, that locked up about 96% of businesses who found that that was their best channel. Interestingly, you may be surprised to know that the next most successful channel was Twitter, which was only 2%. It just really spoke to the dominance of those two channels, Facebook and Instagram. Even though people were on a real variety of different channels, it was really those two more established channels where people were seeing the best results. One person found TikTok was the best for them. Only 4 people, or 1% of the people responding, actually said that Pinterest was the best, which surprised me. I thought we'd see more people saying that most of their sales came from Pinterest, but undeniably, Facebook and Instagram were the very clear winners when it came to which social media channel was driving the most sales. Given that marketing is often listed by small business owners as the most time-consuming or one of the most time-consuming activities for them, I wanted to dig in a bit more to understand how much people were actually spending on marketing. And I was quite surprised by the answers. I thought that they were slightly lower than I was expecting. So around 13% of people said that they spent under an hour marketing their business a week. About a third said it was 1 to 3 hours. And then about 27% were on 3 to 5 hours. And really only about a quarter of people were spending more than 5 hours. So 5 to 10 hours at 14%. And then over 10 hours, about 12% of people said they were spending over 10 hours a week on their marketing. And only a really small proportion of people, only 1% of businesses were actually outsourcing their marketing, which also surprised me. What was really fascinating was I was curious to see the impact that this had on turnover. So I thought, okay, well, can you see that the businesses that are spending less time on marketing are having less turnover? What's the correlation here? Is it more hours on marketing, more turnover? And to be honest, I really didn't see anything that jumped out at me. When I looked at it compared to turnover, I couldn't really see that more hours on marketing meant more turnover. Also, what was interesting was that over time, when I looked at the number of hours that people were spending on marketing compared to the age of the business, it was actually really interesting to see that over time people were spending less time on marketing. And I think realistically, when I think about my own business journey, when I think about the journey of a lot of people that I speak to in the club and clients, that doesn't really surprise me, because I think at the beginning, when you're trying to get going with your marketing efforts, you need to be trying so many different things, so many different types of content, so many different channels, just trying to connect with different people in lots of different ways, that actually as you get traction over time, you can probably find quicker and easier ways of doing things. And also you just stop doing the things that don't give you results. So at the beginning, you have to try lots of things, but then over time, you can really scale that back. But I thought that was absolutely fascinating that, number one, that it didn't seem that it was a clear-cut answer to spend more time on your marketing. And number two, that the amount of time people were spending on marketing actually was reducing over the age of the business. Something that I am very passionate about is email marketing, because I believe that it is one of the most important tools for small businesses. And I feel very passionate about it. And I really wanted to ask some questions to find out just how product businesses were really using their email marketing, as well as taking a look at the size of their list and the frequency, because again, I couldn't really find many good statistics. So many of the questions that I asked in this survey really came from me and clients and members of the Resilient Retail Club talking about how it was hard to know when we talked about size of a list or what they were doing with their email marketing, to have an understanding of where they compare to other businesses at a similar stage to them. So this was really, again, the thought process with the email marketing questions. I was pleased to see that 76%, so over 3/4 of businesses, had an email list. The vast majority of them had under 500 subscribers. Now, again, I do think that 500 engaged subscribers, just the same with social media following, 500 subscribers who are engaged is not to say that a list of 10,000 non-engaged is better than 500 engaged. But it was interesting to see that really did account for the majority of people had under 500. Again, for benchmarking, I broke out the number of subscribers on an email list by the age of the business. Again, time was clearly a huge factor. I saw, if you caught last week's episode when I was talking about turnover, then time was a huge factor in turnover as well. And I think it's important to say these things, because I think it's important to normalize that when you start a business, it does take time to gain traction. So if you're sitting here expecting to get a 10,000 person email list in the first year of business, it's just not realistic. In fact, 80% of those who had a business under a year old had under 500 subscribers, compared to about 32% of businesses who had been running for over 5 years, for example. In terms of actually using the email list, about 40% of businesses did not send regular emails. So there's clearly more to be done. It's one thing to have a list. A lot of people were not really sure about what to do with it. So, for example, within the Resilient Retail Club, actually this week, I just released an email marketing course, which goes over some of the things like those important questions, like how do you come up with what to say in your email newsletter? But I thought it was really fascinating. So people had lists, but far more weren't actually using them. And only 13% of businesses sent an email on a weekly basis or more frequently. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that if you want to improve your open rates and click-through rates, things like that, then actually sending more frequent emails is a better way of doing that. And people I have worked with who have weekly emails, who've got into that routine, generally see really good results. So it was interesting to see there's obviously a lot of potential there in terms of email marketing for people to grow their lists and also to send emails to the lists more frequently. I did ask for open and click-through rate information. It was quite hard for me to actually really get a gauge on this because it wasn't a multiple choice answer. It was just a free text. So people put in a variety of responses. I did go through and have a look. I wasn't really able to pull sort of significant numbers out. A lot of people weren't really sure about their open and click-through rates. But what I did see was a large number of businesses talking about 30 to 40% open rates being pretty common. And some businesses were reporting as high as 60%, believe it or not. If you look at e-commerce industry benchmarks, for example, they often talk about email lists, email open rates on e-commerce being around 20%. Well, it was interesting to see that the small businesses were reporting much higher rates than that. And it doesn't really surprise me in as much as I think a lot of small businesses have a really good relationship or a more kind of involved relationship with their customers, or their customers just feel more strongly about the small businesses than maybe if you're on a giant email list, like if you're on an ASOS email list or a John Lewis, something like that. So I wasn't really surprised to see that the open rates were overall higher. But again, for those people, if you're listening to this and you're thinking, well, my open rates aren't nearly that high, I definitely think it was interesting to see how few businesses were sending those really regular, that weekly email. There is, as I said, evidence to suggest that more regular emails, if you send somebody a weekly email, they kind of get into a routine of opening it. And often people see their open rates go up when they send a weekly email. So one of the final areas that I wanted to explore when I was asking product businesses about their marketing was their paid advertising. This was really interesting because it's one of those questions, again, that comes up a lot. And it's one of those areas that a lot of people really are curious about and often feel quite conflicted about in terms of paying for traffic. So the first question I asked actually was, what kind of paid traffic do you use? What was interesting to see was that actually nearly half of businesses did no paid traffic activity at all. In other words, they weren't using any form of paid advertising. The next biggest category was Instagram and Facebook advertising. That was about 38% of businesses. So about 48% of businesses did no paid advertising and about 38% used Instagram and Facebook. The rest was made up by a mixture of Google ads. Some people did paid media, so advertorials. Some people talked about Etsy advertising. Some people did other social media ads, for example, Pinterest promoted pins. And then some people did promoted listings on Amazon, for example. I was curious to see if there was a particular tipping point in the business life cycle, if you like, where people suddenly started using advertising. Was it varied really by the age of the business? When I looked at it in terms of the use of ads by the age of the business, it was quite interesting. So under a year, there was definitely a shift, but it wasn't that major. So it basically went from about 55% of people who'd been going for less than a year didn't use ads, and about 45% of people did. And that sort of flopped. So by the time you got to over 5 years, then about 55% of people were using ads and about 45% of people weren't. So it wasn't a huge swing, but it just kind of ticked so that the majority of people over 5 years were using ads, but then not everybody was. It was almost half of people, even for businesses that had been running for more than 5 years, were not using paid advertising. The big question was about, or for me, what I wanted to do then was dig into, okay, all right, I can see whether or not people run ads and I can see what their turnover is. So let's have a look at the impact of running ads on your turnover and the impact of running ads on the amount of money that people are able to pay themselves. And the reason I wanted to do that was just really to see, as I said, a lot of people have questions. Do they need to be running ads? Do they not need to be running ads? Are they missing out if they aren't running ads? And I thought this would be a really interesting exercise, and I wanted to see if it was a clear result. It can be a difficult decision for small business owners. Ultimately, if you think about bigger retailers, they all use paid traffic. So it is definitely an element. As businesses grow, then it is very common. Almost all businesses, if they're going to grow and scale, at some point will need paid traffic. But it's often about the question of when to introduce it, and when is too early, when will you get your maximum benefit from it? Because ultimately, the most profitable traffic is going to be organic traffic because you didn't pay to acquire it. But on the other hand, it's not like most businesses that scale don't use paid traffic, because a lot of them will. So it was just really interesting to see from this what it looked like when you looked at the businesses using paid advertising versus the ones that weren't. I have to say, you can have a look at the graph. It's figure number 35 on page 38 of the report. Again, if you go to resilientretailclub.com/survey, I'd love to know what you think about it. If you want to shoot me over a DM on Instagram, tell me what you thought about this. Basically, what it showed was that the businesses that used paid advertising typically had slightly better turnover. The distribution of their turnover figures looked healthier, if you like, compared to the businesses that weren't. But that said, there was still a spread of businesses. So, for example, people who weren't using paid advertising, there was a business that was turning over more than £500,000 and they weren't using advertising. There were also businesses in the £100,000 to £250,000 bracket, for example, that weren't using advertising. About 49% of businesses not using advertising were under £10,000 turnover, compared to 32% of businesses who did use paid advertising. And there were a larger proportion of businesses in that over six-figure category for the people who used paid advertising compared to the ones that didn't. So I guess what it's showing you is that it's not a silver bullet, but I think anybody who's a paid advertising expert would say the same thing. It's not like an absolute golden ticket. This is it. If you run paid advertising, your business will become a six-figure business. There's still a lot of businesses having a variety of experiences with their turnover, despite whether or not they run advertising. And it was a similar thing when you looked at the founder's salary. So, for example, 49% of business owners who weren't running ads didn't pay themselves. And then about 38% of the people who did use paid advertising didn't pay themselves either. So again, you did have people who were paying themselves more than £5,000 a month who weren't running advertising. And then you also had people, who were paying themselves between £2,000 and £5,000 a month without running advertising. So again, that's figure 36 on page 39. Go take a look. Tell me what your conclusion was. I kind of felt very mixed after this. I was like, okay, you can see that generally speaking, it does slightly improve the results for businesses when they're running paid. But again, no silver bullet. In terms of the actual ad spent, of course, this is the other thing. I could only see whether or not they were running ads, yes or no. I didn't drill down to that sort of nth degree to work out exactly how much they were spending. There was a really big variation on this as well. Again, I asked it it was a sort of a free text answer, so it wasn't a multiple choice. It was kind of slightly harder to gauge from that exactly, what was a typical amount to spend. I would say most people were in the bracket of spending around £200 to £300 a month on their advertising. And then higher turnover businesses were spending somewhere between £2,000 and £5,000 on ads a month. And I also asked what percentage of sales were coming from ads, because I was curious to see, again, what's a typical experience. By far the most common answer that people had was that they just didn't know. They didn't necessarily know what percentage of their sales were coming from their advertising. There were a handful of businesses that were reporting up to 80 or 90% of sales coming from advertising. It was a small percentage. It was only about 2% of people who had figures that high. Most of the people who did use advertising and knew what that figure was were reporting around 30 to 40% of sales coming from paid advertising. So there you go. I hope you found that really helpful and really useful to understand a little bit more about what a typical retail business does in terms of their marketing. They're all on Instagram. Instagram and Facebook are by far the most successful channels for product businesses. I thought that was really interesting as well. Just when you consider the amount of work that goes into launching a social media channel, it's actually very interesting to me to see that that you can have presence on lots of different ones, but ultimately for most people, they're going to be most successful on Facebook and Instagram. It was also really interesting when I looked at the team structure, because the thing that really struck me, again, this is all in the report. I've got a whole section on what help people get. It's really fascinating to look at it, because the reality is for most people, they are single founders. So of the 300 and over 300 businesses that answered, the vast majority had one employee, and about 2/3 of them, it was one full-time employee or one or more full-time employees. So it was a sort of a full-time business being run full-time by one person or more than one person. And about 1/3 of the businesses were actually being run part-time, being run by one part-time person. And there was also not a huge amount of outsourcing going on, really. There was a lot of people, about 36% of businesses, for example, got no outside help at all. And of the businesses that did have outside help, I wouldn't necessarily have said that it was kind of day-to-day help. It was more things like their accounting or their product photography. The most commonly outsourced role was making products, and that was only about 20% of businesses that outsourced that. So businesses don't have a huge amount of help. They don't have a lot of time for their marketing. So it was just really useful to reflect on that when it came down to the fact that a lot of different channels didn't necessarily equate to a lot more success, or they weren't. It wasn't like, sometimes people ask me things like, am I missing something? Is there sort of this one secret channel that everyone's using for their marketing that's producing these amazing results? And I think the answer to that is most people's most successful marketing channel, not necessarily their total sales driver, but when talking about actual marketing, is Instagram or Facebook. So that covers about 95% of businesses. So I thought that was really fascinating. I'd love to know what you took away from today's episode. I'd love to know what surprised you. And I would love to know what you think of the report as well. As I said, head over to resilientretailclub.com/survey to get your free copy if you haven't done so already. And come back next week when I will be talking about the one big thing that helped businesses move forward, as well as their biggest learning. And I can't wait to share that with you. Have a great week. If you've enjoyed this week's episode, then I invite you to check out resilientretailclub.com. The Resilient Retail Club is the membership for anyone wanting to start, grow, or scale a profitable product business. No more trawling Google trying to find the answers to your questions, or wading through general business advice that speaks mainly to service-based businesses. Whether you're still at the idea stage or you've been going for a while but want to get more focused and organised when it comes to your business, the Resilient Retail Club is the place for you. With a library of courses tailored to creative product businesses, several live sessions a month, and a supportive and active community, the Resilient Retail Club is the perfect membership to help you hit your goals faster. Check it out at resilientretailclub.com.